Hey guys, tonight we slip into the Roman twilight, where stone shadows and ancient echoes wait for you. Picture yourself wandering the uneven cobblestones, the kind that trip up tourists with gelato in one hand and selfie stick in the other. The air smells faintly of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and there it is, the Colosseum. Half of it towers proudly, and half of it, well, looks like someone pressed delete on their keyboard. You squint at the jagged edge, the missing arcades, the gaps that make you think, wait, shouldn't this be a perfect circle? Spoiler, no, it hasn't been for a very long time. And if you'd been around during its heyday, you probably wouldn't survive the smell of 50,000 sweaty Romans crammed together, much less the lions. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trace the rim of the arena with your eyes, noting how the arches stop abruptly, like a half-eaten cookie left on a marble platter. This is the famous missing half of the Colosseum. You could think of it as the world's most expensive bite mark. Once upon a time, the amphitheater was a perfect ellipse, oval, strong, covered in travertine marble that gleamed in the sun. It stood for Rome's engineering genius, a living propaganda machine for emperors who wanted to say, look at me, I can afford this much spectacle. Gladiators, wild beasts, sea battles, yes, they flooded the floor for mock naval fights. It was the Netflix of the first century, but time is merciless. That gleaming ring lost its sheen, then lost its stability. By the Middle Ages, it looked less like an eternal monument and more like a stubbornly collapsing stadium. And that's when half of it started disappearing, not in one dramatic collapse, but slowly, a little chunk here, a stone block there. Like your favorite sweater that somehow unravels even though you swear you're careful with it. The big culprit? Earthquakes. Rome is not sitting quietly, the ground occasionally shrugs, sending tremors through its monuments. Historians point to quakes in 847 and 1349 as the prime wrecking balls. In 1349, in particular, a nasty one rattled the city so badly that the southern side of the Colosseum, the heavier, less supported half, caved like a toppled Jenga tower. You stand in that collapsed shadow now, imagining the dust, the crash, the sudden realization of oh no. Half our city's landmark just face-planted. And here's where the story gets almost comical. Instead of repairing it, Romans looked at the mountain of rubble and thought, oh, free building materials. Recycling wasn't trendy back then, but pragmatism was. So chunks of fallen travertine ended up in the foundations of palaces, churches, and even hospitals. The Colosseum was basically Rome's Home Depot, open 24/7. If you trace your fingers along the exposed cut edges, you can almost hear the chisels. Some gaps are cleanly stripped, not by nature but by human hands. People pried out the marble facing and hauled it off in donkey carts. The missing half wasn't just destroyed, it was consumed. Rome ate its own landmark to feed its growing skyline. Historians still argue whether that was an act of necessity, stone was expensive, after all, or sheer disregard for history. After all, to medieval eyes, the Colosseum wasn't yet the romantic ruin we idolize, it was a convenient pile of pre-carved blocks. The word ruin porn didn't exist yet, but if it did, you can bet poets would have gotten fewer Instagram shots and masons would have still been hammering away. Imagine standing in the arena floor at night, looking up at the broken rim. One half looms intact, arches stacked neatly like rows of teeth. The other half just stops, jagged and raw. A playground for bats, a silhouette that makes you wonder what once was. Rome doesn't hide its scars, it parades them. That missing half is less a failure than a reminder. Nothing, not even the greatest empire, is earthquake-proof, a quirky tidbit. For centuries, locals thought the Colosseum was some sort of magical or cursed site. They nicknamed it the Coliseo, from the Latin colossus, because of its sheer size, but also whispered about it as a haunted arena. Goats grazed where gladiators once fell. And superstitions swirled about ghosts clinging to the ruins. If you've ever complained about creepy vibes in your basement, imagine living next door to that. You lean against the cool stone, trying to reconcile the grandeur with the ruin. You picture the arena full, the crowd roaring, the emperor giving a thumbs up or down. Then you open your eyes and see emptiness, holes where walls should be, arches framing the night sky. That's the mystery we're easing into tonight. What exactly happened to the missing half of the Colosseum, and how a monument built to embody permanence slowly became the most glamorous skeleton in Rome's closet. You shuffle a little further along the edge of the ruins, and suddenly you're aware of how quiet the place feels in the late evening. The traffic hum of modern Rome is still there, sure, but in this space the hush seems louder. Your eyes drift up the jagged south side, the missing half, and you picture it not in ruins, but mid-collapse. Imagine the ground trembling under your sandals, the air thick with dust as cracks shoot through those massive blocks. That was Rome in 847 and again in 1349, when earthquakes gave the Colosseum a series of rude wake-up calls. If the amphitheater were a person, this was the equivalent of breaking a hip and never quite recovering. You feel the tremors in your imagination, the shudder of stone. The sudden screams of townsfolk, the groan of arches splitting. A fact to keep with you, Rome sits near fault lines that occasionally stretch and snap. The medieval quakes didn't destroy the whole building, but they took down crucial support on the weaker south side. That imbalance explains why today's Colosseum looks lopsided, half missing like a cracked pie. Now here's where things get interesting. The rubble didn't just sit around as a sad reminder. Nope, it practically went into circulation like loose change. You picture rubble being carted away by oxen, ending up in the foundations of other Roman landmarks. When you walk past San Giovanni Laterano, the papal cathedral, you're basically seeing bits of Colosseum hiding in its bones. This wasn't looting so much as practical recycling. In a way, the Colosseum became a donor organ, keeping other Roman structures alive. You smirk, because even in history, people can't resist the lure of free stuff. The collapsed stones were there, just lying about, like IKEA furniture with no instruction manual. Why carve new blocks when the empire's greatest stadium had already gift-wrapped some? But not everyone was thrilled about this arrangement. Some chroniclers grumbled that Rome's identity was literally being carted off brick by brick. Others, however, shrugged and thought, it's just an old stadium. We need chapels more than we need lions. Historians still argue whether the collapse saved the building, because at least half survived, or doomed it, because once people got the taste for quarrying, they never stopped. Picture yourself walking through a medieval marketplace. Fresh bread smells drift from stalls, monks haggle over parchment, and in the corner, a guy is selling Colosseum marble chunks like they're rare souvenirs. Straight from the arena, authentic. He probably didn't say. But you get the idea. Recycled stone was a booming business, and everyone wanted a slice of Rome's past for their new projects. One quirky tidbit. The rubble wasn't always used nobly. Some of it reinforced sewers and wells. Yes, parts of the Colosseum spent centuries underground guiding wastewater instead of gladiators. That's a demotion if there ever was one. You can almost hear the old amphitheater sigh, from spectacles to sewage, all in a few centuries. And yet, the Colosseum itself didn't completely give up. Stand in its shadow and you sense defiance, arches that still hold, even scarred, even stripped. It's like a stubborn grandparent, hunched, but still standing. Each quake, each collapse left scars, but the north side clings on, weathering centuries of wind, rain, and ambitious stone thieves. There's a moment where you close your eyes and imagine being a medieval Roman, walking past the ruin right after an earthquake. Dust still lingers, neighbors whisper about divine punishment. Was this collapse God's will, a cosmic thumbs down on gladiator cruelty? Some believed so. They saw the crumbling walls as proof the Colosseum was cursed by the blood spilled there. And yet, the practical folks just saw an opportunity. New walls needed repairing, palaces needed finishing touches. The rubble became Rome's unofficial quarry, filling markets with stone like bread rolls at dawn. You catch yourself smiling because humans never change. Even disaster becomes an economy, so you linger by the jagged edge, thinking about how earthquakes aren't just geological, they're historical editors. With each shake, the Colosseum lost paragraphs of itself, and Rome repurposed them into new chapters elsewhere. That's why today, when you marvel at half a stadium, you're also admiring an unintentional donation that sprawls across an entire city. You linger near the crumbled south side, and now your imagination zooms forward a little into the medieval centuries. The earthquakes had already broken the Colosseum's back, but the real story of loss comes not just from nature but from people. You follow the shuffle of footsteps into the early Middle Ages, when the amphitheater, no longer used for gladiator shows, became an all-you-can-carry stone buffet. You picture masons with chisels strapped to their belts, clambering over the ruins like kids on a jungle gym. Except instead of sliding down slides, they're prying blocks out of walls. Thick ropes creak as blocks of travertine are lowered down, thudding onto wooden carts. Horses snort. Dust rises, and off they go, down narrow lanes toward half-built churches or crumbling palazzos that desperately need reinforcement. It feels almost cheeky, like watching people carve up a sports arena while the game is still going on. And here's the kicker, there wasn't really a sense of preservation at the time. For medieval Romans, the Colosseum was a convenient pile of ready-to-use stone, not a sacred relic of empire. You don't protect a quarry, you exploit it. The marketplace scene comes back into your mind, vendors selling fish, bakers hawking bread, and amid it all, a steady stream of carts rattling by with blocks so massive you'd swear they belonged in a pyramid. You imagine yourself trying to ask one of the workers, "Hey, aren't you worried you're destroying history?" And getting a shrug in reply. To them, history was the basilica going up down the street, not the ruin crumbling behind them. One mainstream fact to drop here, the Basilica of San Pietro in Vincoli, famous for Michelangelo's statue of Moses, contains chunks of Colosseum stone in its walls. And it's not the only one. Many Roman churches became patchwork quilts of ancient materials, stitched together with stolen amphitheater bones. Walk into a chapel, look up at the columns, and you're essentially staring at former Colosseum ribs. The quirky tidbit? It wasn't just churches. Nobles used Colosseum stones to build their private fortresses. The Frangipani family, yes, a name that now makes you think of desserts, turned the Colosseum itself into part of their fortified estate in the 12th century. Picture dinner parties inside the old arena, crossbows stationed at the arches, and a family crest proudly hanging where gladiators once fought. It's bizarrely domestic, like converting Madison Square Garden into your living room. Historians still argue whether this constant stone harvesting was the inevitable fate of abandoned monuments or if it marked a special kind of neglect unique to medieval Rome. After all, not every ancient ruin was stripped so aggressively. Some amphitheaters survived in better shape, even in smaller towns. Was Rome simply too desperate for building materials? Or too arrogant, assuming the Colosseum could never truly vanish no matter how much was carted away? You trail behind a medieval mason hauling a chunk of marble. He wipes sweat from his brow and mutters about the Pope's new project. You realize that for him, the Colosseum isn't a ruin, it's his paycheck. Each block is dinner for his family. Suddenly, the act of quarrying feels less like vandalism and more like survival. The sounds echo in your head, hammer strikes ringing against hollow walls, the shuffle of carts, the clang of iron wedges splitting stone. By the time the dust settles, entire sections of outer wall are missing, like pulled teeth leaving gaps in a smile. And yet the Colosseum still towers, stubbornly clinging to half its bulk, as if daring anyone to take more. You look up again at those missing arches. And they no longer seem like pure accident. You see the fingerprints of masons, the ambitions of nobles, the quiet orders of popes. It wasn't just earthquakes that stole half the Colosseum, it was generations of Romans carrying it away piece by piece, until only the shadow of its former self remained. You drift forward in time, still wandering those arches, and suddenly the air smells different: incense, candle smoke, and the faint perfume of power. You've arrived in the papal centuries, when Rome's popes looked at the Colosseum not as a ruin or a quarry but as a divine hardware store. You picture yourself slipping into the Vatican corridors, parchment rustling as papal advisors sketch out new projects, a basilica here, a palace there. And when someone inevitably asks, "Where will we get the stone?" the answer is almost always the same: the Colosseum. You peer over the Pope's shoulder as he gazes at drawings for St. Peter's Basilica, one of the grandest construction efforts in all of Christendom. Guess where some of the marble and travertine came from? Yep, our half-gone stadium. The irony hits you: the arena that once hosted gladiator slaughter became the raw material for the spiritual heart of Christianity. That's like tearing down a casino to build a church, only with lions and emperors thrown in. One mainstream historical fact: during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, popes explicitly authorized the mining of the Colosseum. Pope Sixtus V even had grand plans to repurpose the entire structure as a wool factory staffed by Rome's poor. The plan flopped, but just imagine it: looms clattering under the arches where gladiators once fought, sheep bleating where tigers used to roar. It would have been history's strangest job conversion. You smirk as you watch masons carve inscriptions into fresh papal buildings, their chisels biting into stone that once echoed with screams and applause. It's recycling on a cosmic scale, pagan entertainment dissolved into Christian sanctity. Was it sacrilege or poetic justice? Historians still argue whether the papal building spree saved the Colosseum by keeping parts of it alive in new forms, or whether it accelerated the ruin's humiliation. But not all popes were ruthless scavengers. Some, staring at the skeletal arches, began to feel a tug of conscience. By the 18th century, Pope Benedict XIV declared the Colosseum a sacred site, claiming it as a memorial to Christian martyrs. Never mind that historians today debate whether gladiators and persecuted Christians ever really crossed paths here in large numbers. The story stuck, and suddenly the same church that once carted off blocks now wrapped the Colosseum in crosses and prayers. A quirky tidbit? At one point, the Colosseum became a sort of papal mine complete with guards. Imagine uniformed men standing at the arches like bouncers at a nightclub, making sure only authorized masons hauled away stone for holy projects. It's almost comedic, the holiest men in Christendom running what amounts to a construction mafia. You stroll through the ruins in your mind, watching as one era's exploitation bleeds into another's reverence. It's dizzying. First, earthquakes split the arena. Then medieval masons pried at it like vultures. And now, popes are officially sanctioning its dismantling, one saintly stone at a time. What lingers with you most is the irony. The Colosseum, designed as a monument to imperial might, became both victim and donor to papal ambition. Its half-vanished side is like a resume of everything Rome has ever wanted to build: empires, churches, legends. You run your hand along the pockmarked walls and imagine the journey of each block. Cut, hauled, and reborn somewhere else in the city. Half of the Colosseum isn't missing at all, it's just hiding in plain sight, disguised as holy architecture. You lean back against the cool stone, letting centuries blur together, and now the Colosseum isn't a papal quarry anymore, it's a Renaissance playground. By the 15th and 16th centuries, noble families and civic builders looked at this hulking ruin and thought, perfect. Free materials for our new mansions. You follow the creak of wooden carts again, this time fancier, guided not by dusty masons but by servants working under aristocratic orders. The Colosseum became the personal Home Depot of the powerful. One mainstream fact: the Palazzo Venezia, the Palazzo della Cancelleria, and even parts of the Palazzo Barberini are built with blocks recycled from the Colosseum. So when you wander Renaissance Rome today, you're literally tripping over the ghost of the amphitheater. Its body is scattered across the city like a stony jigsaw puzzle. You imagine being there when giant chunks were carted away. The sound is thunderous, not from earthquakes this time but from deliberate chisels and pulleys. Workers climb ladders up the cracked outer walls, hammer wedges into seams, and pry out blocks the size of sofas. The walls groan, the arches sag, and another piece of the Colosseum vanishes into someone's palace facade. To the Renaissance elite, this wasn't theft, it was refinement. Why leave old pagan stone rotting in a ruin when you could polish it into a fountain where water sparkles under moonlight? And speaking of fountains, Bernini's Trevi Fountain, the most famous in the world, may not be made entirely from Colosseum stone, but many fountains across the city are. You picture tourists today tossing coins into these waters, never realizing they're making wishes into recycled gladiator debris. That's a quirky tidbit to savor. The stone that once framed roaring lions now frames splashing carp. Historians still argue whether Renaissance quarrying was an unavoidable part of urban renewal or sheer cultural vandalism. Some scholars point out that Renaissance builders adored antiquity and drew inspiration from its ruins, yet they had no qualms about dismantling them. It's a paradox, praising the beauty of Roman engineering while pulling it apart brick by brick. You follow a nobleman through his new palazzo. He beams with pride, pointing at his grand staircase, boasting about the ancient Roman stone that lines it. He's not lying, his house is literally wearing the Colosseum as a coat. You glance out the window at the half-gone amphitheater and wonder if he ever feels guilty. Probably not. He's too busy bragging to his dinner guests about his estate's imperial dignity. You laugh softly to yourself. It's as if the Colosseum was Rome's stony credit card, swiped again and again to pay for the Renaissance glow-up. Churches, palaces, fountains, every prestige project in Rome bore a little piece of the amphitheater. You walk the modern city streets, and suddenly you realize, the Colosseum isn't just missing half of itself, it's everywhere. It's scattered across Rome like stardust, its bones holding up doorways, its face polished into ornaments, its soul diluted but alive. The ruin you stand in now feels lighter, emptier, but not dead. You run your fingers over the pockmarked walls, little holes where iron clamps once held blocks together. Many were ripped out in these centuries, too. Sold off as scrap. The stone isn't just scarred by time, it's tattooed with history's greed. And yet, the north side still holds, proud and stubborn. The Colosseum survives not because it was preserved, but because it was too massive to vanish entirely. As you gaze up, twilight softens into night, and you can't help but think of all the aristocratic banquets that once clinked glasses with Colosseum stone, all the prayers whispered under ceilings held aloft by its ribs. The amphitheater's missing half isn't really gone, it's just spread like breadcrumbs through centuries of Rome's ambition. You turn a corner, and suddenly the mood changes again. No longer marble blocks trundling toward papal projects or noble palaces, now the Colosseum has slipped into an entirely different role. By the High Middle Ages, parts of the arena had collapsed enough to create cozy pockets, sheltered alcoves, and shadowy chambers. And humans, as they always do, filled the void. You're standing in a neighborhood built inside the Colosseum itself. You hear the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Step closer, and you see smoke curling from a makeshift forge wedged beneath one of the arches. A man pounds away at horseshoes while his kids chase each other through the dusty arena floor. Just beyond him, a woman leans from a crooked wooden balcony, shaking out laundry that flutters against the ancient stone. The Colosseum, once Rome's proudest stage, has become a ramshackle apartment block. One mainstream fact: by the 12th century, families literally lived inside the Colosseum. Historians know this from records describing homes, taverns, and even small workshops built against the ruined walls. For a while, it functioned almost like a fortified village. The Frangipani family, whom you met earlier when they turned the amphitheater into a fortress, controlled much of it, leasing spaces to tenants. Imagine your rent agreement saying, apartment, 1 bedroom, amphitheater view. The quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found evidence of gardens and even livestock being kept inside the Colosseum. Picture goats munching weeds on the arena floor, chickens scratching in the shadow of collapsed vaults. It was part barnyard, part suburb, part ghost town. You walk carefully, trying not to step in goat droppings as a tavern keeper offers you a clay cup of sour wine, and this strange domestic phase wasn't short-lived. For centuries, the Colosseum was less a ruin to be admired and more a practical hodgepodge of dwellings and trades. Historians still argue whether this ruined amphitheater-turned-village was a symbol of resilience, Romans making do with what they had, or just evidence of how far the city had fallen from its imperial glory. Was it survival ingenuity, or was it desperation in stone? The sensory details are vivid. You smell roasting meat from a tavern spit. You hear laughter from a dice game played on a broken column drum. You watch candlelight flicker against faded graffiti scratched by medieval hands into marble. It's eerie and lively all at once, the ghosts of gladiators whispering beneath the chatter of cobblers and weavers. As you wander deeper, you notice how the architecture itself has been hijacked. Arches once meant for crowds now frame rickety staircases. Corridors that led to gladiators' cells now house chickens. The building is both ruin and alive, like a great beast refusing to die, its carcass turned into shelter. You lean against a cracked pillar, listening to the city hum beyond the walls, and marvel at how the Colosseum never truly disappeared, it just kept transforming. Today it's a monument, back then it was a neighborhood. A ruin is only a ruin when people stop using it, and the Colosseum has rarely gone unused. You step back out into the moonlit arena floor. The night air carries the faint smell of hay and hearth smoke. In your mind's eye, the Colosseum is no longer the amphitheater of emperors. It's the apartment complex of smiths, tavern keepers, farmers, and children. And somehow, that feels just as human as the gladiator games ever did. You stand still for a moment, letting the sounds of medieval smithies and taverns fade, and now the Colosseum settles into an even quieter phase. No clang of hammers, no clink of wine cups, just silence, interrupted by the occasional bleat of a goat. That's right, by the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, large stretches of the Colosseum weren't bustling with tenants anymore. Instead, they were overgrown, abandoned, and given over to plants and livestock. You wander into the arena and suddenly find yourself in a meadow, the grass brushes your ankles. Wildflowers sprout in cracks where marble slabs once gleamed. Ivy creeps over arches like nature's graffiti. Birds dart in and out of crevices, nesting in the pockmarks where iron clamps were stolen centuries before. You tilt your head back and see the night sky framed not by intact walls but by ragged stone teeth, half gone and softened by moss. The Colosseum has gone feral. One mainstream fact: in the 17th and 18th centuries, botanists documented hundreds of plant species growing inside the Colosseum, some so exotic they puzzled over how they got there. Seeds, it turned out, were likely carried by animals, birds, or even human clothing. The amphitheater became a kind of accidental greenhouse, hosting Mediterranean wildflowers, but also oddities from distant lands. The ruin was literally a biodiversity hotspot. Quirky tidbit: goats really did graze here. Locals used the arena floor as a pasture. Imagine leaning on a broken column while goats munch weeds, their bells clinking in the twilight. Children played tag where gladiators once fought to the death, their laughter echoing off scarred stone. You can't help but smirk at the thought, history's grandest blood sports stadium, reduced to a goat pen, and yet, the ruin carried a darker reputation too. People whispered that ghosts of gladiators and martyrs still wandered the shadows. By moonlight, the Colosseum was said to groan with phantom applause, or the faint clash of unseen swords. Historians still argue whether these ghost stories arose from genuine superstition or were simply the byproduct of its eerie atmosphere. Either way, it added a spectral weight to the silence. you stroll the overgrown arena, careful not to trip over roots pushing through the stone. The smell is earthy, damp soil, wild herbs, and the faint musk of animals. You kneel and touch a small flower, fragile yet stubborn, blooming in the crack of a fallen wall. The Colosseum, once drenched in blood, now nurtures life. That's not just poetic, it's literal history, but the ghosts won't quite let go. Locals avoided the ruin at night, warning that demons or restless spirits lingered where thousands once died. You glance up at the moonlight pouring through an arch and feel the goosebumps creep along your arms. Even today, standing alone in the Colosseum after dark, the silence has a thickness to it, as if the walls remember too much, and yet, you smile too. Because in the morning, this haunted pasture became utterly ordinary, goats grazing, weeds swaying, children chasing each other under the arches. It's a reminder that even ruins slip into routine, that life insists on filling every gap, even the gaps carved by empire and earthquakes. You leave the arena floor slowly, listening to the crunch of gravel underfoot. And glance back one more time. In your mind's eye, you see both realities layered together, gladiators fighting lions, and goats munching dandelions. The Colosseum holds both truths at once, death and rebirth, spectacle and silence. And its missing half feels less like loss and more like an opening, a space where nature and memory seep in. The meadow of goats and whispers of ghosts dissolve as you step forward in time, into the 18th century. Suddenly, the Colosseum is no longer just a haunt for locals and livestock, it has become a stage once again, but this time for poets, painters, and travelers hungry for ruins. You find yourself among men in powdered wigs and women in long skirts, sketchbooks open, quills scratching, sighs escaping their lips as they gaze upon the jagged arches. This is the age of Romanticism, when ruins weren't eyesores but sources of deep, dreamy inspiration. The Colosseum was no longer just a crumbling relic, it was the ultimate muse. You stand beside a young artist perched on a broken step, carefully sketching the fractured wall with its play of light and shadow. He doesn't care that half of it is missing, in fact, that makes it more beautiful. A ruin, after all, is the poetry of time written in stone. Mainstream fact, during the 1700s, the Colosseum became a major stop on the Grand Tour, a sort of cultural pilgrimage for wealthy Europeans. Young aristocrats from England, France, and elsewhere came to Rome to soak in antiquity. Guidebooks practically insisted they weep over the Colosseum's fallen grandeur. And many did. They wrote letters home describing moonlit walks among the arches, or how the ruins seemed to whisper of Rome's faded glory. Quirky tidbit. Some romantic poets were almost too into it. Lord Byron, for instance, waxed dramatic about standing in the Colosseum at night, claiming he could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Others staged moonlit strolls through the arena as if they were actors in their own tragic plays. Imagine fashionable nobles rehearsing sighs, leaning dramatically on columns, their cloaks billowing, trying to embody melancholy itself. You wander deeper into this era, and the Colosseum shifts into an icon of picturesque decay. Painters dabble their brushes in soft pastels, exaggerating the ivy, the cracks, the jagged profile against glowing sunsets. The ruin becomes a postcard of tragedy and beauty combined. Tourists tuck away pebbles from the arena floor as souvenirs. Some even carve their names into the stone, a little graffiti to ensure eternity remembers them too, but beneath the swooning poetry, the ruin's life was still practical. Locals continued grazing animals, or used parts of the structure for workshops. It wasn't frozen as a museum yet, it was a living, messy space. You picture a nobleman reciting verse by torchlight, while behind him a blacksmith hammers horseshoes in a corner arch. Two Romes colliding, one of imagination, one of workaday survival. At night, the ruin was lantern-lit, filled with long shadows. Lovers sneaked in for secret trysts. Pickpockets hunted distracted tourists. And yet, even with danger and dirt, the Colosseum radiated a kind of majesty that only increased with its decay. The missing half made it all the more haunting. You stand still now, letting your eyes adjust to a painted dusk. The Colosseum is silent except for the scratch of pens and the murmur of foreign tongues. A breeze stirs, carrying the scent of crushed grass and candle wax. You realize the ruin has transformed once again, from battlefield to pasture, from quarry to muse. Each age writes its own script upon these stones. And in this romantic chapter, the missing walls are no longer wounds to be mourned. They are symbols of sublime loss, of the unstoppable passage of time. To the poets, the Colosseum wasn't broken. It was perfect in its imperfection, the kind of beauty that could never exist without destruction. You linger a moment longer, watching the ruin glow in moonlight, and then turn toward the next century, where its story bends once more, not toward poetry, but toward preservation. You step quietly away from the poets and their sighs, and your attention drifts to something less glamorous, little scars in the stone itself. Pockmarks, rows of holes that pepper the Colosseum's arches and blocks. If you lean close, you see they're not the result of weather, nor careless chisels. They're the ghosts of missing metal, the holes left behind after centuries of scavengers yanked out the Colosseum's iron clamps. Mainstream fact: the Colosseum was originally held together with thousands of iron clamps that connected marble blocks. Roman engineers used these metal staples as hidden reinforcements, like invisible stitches keeping the monster of stone from falling apart. But when Rome's fortunes waned, people realized all that iron was just sitting there, waiting to be harvested. Over centuries, laborers hacked and pried at the clamps, chiseling them out of place. That's why, when you stare at the Colosseum today, its face looks like Swiss cheese. And the quirky tidbit? Not all of this looting was done in daylight. Some accounts suggest scavengers crept in at night with lanterns and crude tools, carving away iron piece by piece. Imagine a group of desperate men sneaking under moonlight, muffling the sound of hammers as they chipped metal free, pocketing their prizes, and slipping out before guards noticed. The Colosseum, once filled with roars of the crowd, now echoed with the faint tap-tap of thieves. Historians still argue whether the majority of the missing iron vanished during the Middle Ages or much later in the Renaissance, when metal prices soared. Some argue the plundering peaked when popes themselves authorized scavenging for city projects. Others suggest the bulk of the looting was more grassroots, a long slow bleed across centuries as ordinary Romans scavenged what they could. As you wander under the arches, you picture what those metals became. Maybe the iron now rests inside church railings, melted down for weaponry, or forged into hinges for ordinary city doors. It's strange to think that pieces of the Colosseum could be scattered across Rome, hiding in plain sight. Every time a door creaks open, a bit of the arena echoes with it. The missing metals also created hazards. Pulling out clamps left stones unstable. A block loosened could tumble, threatening anyone below. The structure's half-vanished face wasn't only from earthquakes or papal construction projects, it was also from centuries of nibbling at its iron skeleton until walls began to sag. You could say Rome dismantled its own wonder with a spoon, scraping it hollow from the inside. You drift higher, climbing the battered steps. The holes look almost decorative in places, dotting the stone in neat lines, like stitches unraveling from a massive garment. Tourists today often wonder if they're bullet holes or signs of battles, but no, they're simply Rome's centuries-long recycling program, and while the poets painted the ruin as sublime, the metal scars whispered a more practical tale. People weren't just romanticizing, they were repurposing. The Colosseum was no sacred relic to most locals, it was a stockpile. That iron was too valuable to be left untouched, especially in times of need. You stand still, fingers brushing one of those hollows. The stone feels cold. The cavity smooth from the chisel of some forgotten scavenger. You imagine his sweat, the clink of iron freed from stone, the relief of hauling away something useful from a monument no longer protected. He wasn't thinking of preserving Rome's grandeur, he was thinking of dinner, or tools, or survival, and so, as centuries passed, the Colosseum's flesh grew thinner, its skeleton weaker. Each missing clamp was another rib pulled out, another secret piece stolen. Its beauty today is partly in its brokenness, but that brokenness wasn't always gentle decay, it was purposeful dismantling. The half-gone Colosseum isn't just the story of collapsed walls or stolen marble. It's also a tale of iron veins bled dry, of a giant quietly hollowed out until it became the pockmarked ruin we now romanticize. You glance one last time at those scars, glowing faintly in the fading light, and wonder what Rome would look like if those clamps still bound the stone. Would the Colosseum still be whole? Or was it always destined to bleed, piece by piece, into the city it helped build? The holes in the stone fade behind you, and the air grows heavier with incense. You hear hymns rising where once there were gladiators' cheers. As centuries shift, the Colosseum stops being merely a ruin and starts being remade as something holier, a shrine, a monument to Christian suffering. You wander into this new atmosphere, where crosses line the pathways and whispers of martyrdom hang thicker than the scent of stone dust. Mainstream fact: beginning in the medieval era and into the Renaissance, the Colosseum was gradually associated with Christian martyrs. The story took hold that countless early Christians had been executed here, devoured by lions or slaughtered before jeering crowds. By the 18th century, the Colosseum had become a site of pilgrimage, with popes erecting stations of the cross and even declaring it consecrated ground. A giant cross was planted at its center, transforming the arena from a space of pagan games to one of prayer and remembrance. Here comes the quirky tidbit: there's actually little solid evidence that Christians were killed in the Colosseum at all. Most executions of Christians in Rome happened elsewhere, like the Circus of Nero on Vatican Hill. Yet by the time pilgrims arrived with rosaries in hand, the legend was already too powerful to resist. The Colosseum, with its half-ruined grandeur, looked the part of a martyr's tomb, so it became one by popular imagination. You could say it was history's first case of excellent set design. Historians still argue whether the Christian connection was an organic myth born of rumor or a deliberate rebranding by popes seeking to give the ruins sacred weight. Some believe the story was a clever move to protect the Colosseum from further quarrying. After all, no one would dare dismantle a holy site. Others think the legend simply took root naturally because the place looked like it had to be haunted by tragedy. You stroll past arches now carved with tiny shrines. In the 1700s, Pope Benedict XIV declared the Colosseum a sacred site, cementing its reputation as a martyr's ground. Travelers could now walk its broken paths not just to sketch ruins but to pray. Torches flickered during Good Friday processions, and chants echoed through the hollowed corridors. Imagine the irony: the very structure once associated with brutal entertainments now staged somber reenactments of suffering. Crosses replaced gladiators. Pilgrims knelt where lions once prowled. The Colosseum was no longer a ruin for scavengers, it was a reliquary of faith, whether the facts supported it or not. Still, you sense tension in this transformation. A tourist in 1750 might clutch their guidebook in one hand, weep at the Stations of the Cross, and then wander out to buy a trinket carved from marble pilfered from the same walls. Sacred or not, the Colosseum was still half demolished, still scarred by theft. Yet draping it in Christian stories gave it a new shield, a new reason to survive, and though the martyr's tale may not hold up under strict evidence, it became one of the Colosseum's defining legends. You can still feel it today when you step inside. There's a hush, an expectation of solemnity, even among selfie-snapping tourists. The ruin still carries that weight of imagined sacrifice, a story bigger than the stones themselves. You pause in the dim, sensing how myths can be just as powerful as facts in shaping what survives. The Colosseum is not just broken marble and missing iron, it is also layered with stories, of lions, of saints, of blood that may never have been spilled here at all, and so you walk onward, past crosses glinting in torchlight, into an era when people tried not just to worship here, but to preserve it, sometimes clumsily, sometimes half-heartedly, but always with the sense that this ruin had finally become too precious to lose. The incense and hymns drift away, replaced by the scratch of scaffolding and the grunt of workers. You've stepped into an age when people finally realized, wait, maybe we should actually keep this thing from collapsing entirely. Of course, this is Rome, so nothing happens quickly. Preservation attempts at the Colosseum began unevenly, a patchwork of noble intentions, questionable methods, and occasional disasters. Mainstream fact: the first serious preservation effort came in the 18th century under Pope Benedict XIV, the same pope who consecrated the arena as a holy site. He forbade further quarrying of its stones, effectively declaring the Colosseum off-limits as a free hardware store. Later popes followed suit, initiating projects to stabilize the crumbling arches. In the early 1800s, massive brick buttresses were added to the outer walls, huge triangular props that still look like giant band-aids slapped on the ruin. Now the quirky tidbit: some early restoration attempts were less about preservation and more about optics. One pope ordered the placement of enormous crosses inside, turning the ruin into a kind of outdoor church, but the crosses toppled in a storm and had to be dragged away, leaving locals unimpressed. Another enthusiastic attempt at clearing rubble uncovered not hidden treasure, but a thriving ecosystem of weeds and snakes that had to be relocated. Imagine city officials standing around, scratching their wigs, wondering what to do with crates of relocated reptiles. Historians still argue whether these early preservation projects were driven more by genuine concern for history or by papal vanity. Were the popes protecting the Colosseum for Rome's memory, or were they using it as a monumental backdrop for their own legacies? The massive brick reinforcements, for example, preserved the ruin but also left behind scars that many critics at the time thought ruined the aesthetic. You walk along the base where one of those triangular buttresses leans. It feels oddly modern compared to the ancient arches, a reminder of how every generation leaves its fingerprints, sometimes with clumsy thumbs. Workers of the 19th century hauled bricks and mortar in the sweltering sun, balancing on precarious scaffolds. They didn't see themselves as archaeologists, they were laborers shoring up a ruin with whatever material and method they had. Meanwhile, scholarly voices began debating what exactly should be preserved. Should the Colosseum be restored to something like its original grandeur, rebuilt into a shiny new amphitheater? Or should it remain frozen as a picturesque ruin? The debate was heated. Sometimes literally, an 1820s engineer tried to propose rebuilding sections, but locals threatened to riot at the idea of tampering with their beloved ruin. Even tourists chimed in. Some adored the massive props, believing they proved Rome cared about its heritage. Others scoffed that the Colosseum now looked like a patient strapped into a clunky medical brace. You can almost hear an English nobleman muttering in his journal, "The ruin has been most dreadfully improved." Yet for all the stumbles, these efforts kept the Colosseum from total collapse. Without those ungainly buttresses, the half-gone face might have crumbled further into rubble. Preservation meant compromise, trading pristine ruin for continued survival. You wander a corridor lined with scaffolding, lanterns swinging faintly in the dark. The sound of hammers echoes like a heartbeat, steady and determined. Workers mutter, priests supervise, and architects argue over sketches. Rome is learning, haltingly, that ruins need guardians, not just poets, and in this era, the Colosseum transitions again. No longer a quarry, no longer just a shrine, it begins to be something new, a monument consciously preserved for the future. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but stubbornly, like the ruin itself. The scaffolds creak and fade, and the smell of wet mortar drifts into the air of guidebooks and horse-drawn carriages. You find yourself in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Colosseum isn't just preserved, it's marketed. Suddenly, it's not only Romans climbing its steps, but waves of foreign visitors clutching pamphlets, fanning themselves under the Italian sun, and gasping at the ruin like it's the crown jewel of their personal bucket list. Mainstream fact: by this time, the Grand Tour had become a rite of passage for wealthy Europeans, especially British aristocrats. A proper gentleman's education was considered incomplete without wandering through the Colosseum, sketching a few arches, and writing home about how the grandeur of Rome humbled his soul. Guidebooks flourished, detailing which angle to sketch, which tavern nearby offered the best wine, and of course, exaggerated tales of gladiatorial carnage that made the ruins sound like a blood-soaked epic theater. Quirky tidbit: some tourists got a little carried away. There are countless records of travelers sneaking away with souvenirs, a chip of marble here, a brick fragment there, maybe even a wildflower plucked from the arena floor. One overzealous Englishman bragged about lugging home an entire slab of stone. Picture his butler sighing, trying to fit it in a luggage trunk while muttering, "Sir, perhaps a sketch would have sufficed." Historians still argue whether this wave of tourism helped save the Colosseum by raising awareness or hastened its decay through constant trampling and souvenir theft. Was the Grand Tour a blessing, or just cultural looting in powdered wigs? You wander among these travelers, their chatter filling the air in a dozen languages. Young noblemen try to outdo each other with dramatic journal entries, "Here I stand where thousands perished by sword and claw." Meanwhile, their tutors roll their eyes and remind them that the structure was falling apart because of earthquakes, not lions. Still, the myth of endless gladiator battles sold tickets, so to speak. Artists followed too, sketching, painting, engraving. The Colosseum appeared in countless illustrated travel books, its jagged silhouette romanticized over and over. Some engravers quietly erased scaffolding or locals' laundry lines in their images, preferring the ruin to look timeless and pure. Nobody wanted a souvenir print showing goats munching in the arena. Tour groups swelled during summer. Picture a gaggle of sweating nobles fanning themselves, trying to look properly moved while secretly wishing for gelato. Children scurried about, poking sticks into the ground-level tunnels, half hoping to uncover a hidden gladiator helmet. Local guides, ever the entrepreneurs, embellished stories to keep their audiences hooked, lions leaping out of trapdoors, emperors giving thumbs down, rivers of blood flowing across the sand. Facts were optional, entertainment was the real currency, and entertainment it was. The Colosseum transformed from a ruin locals tolerated to a stage for cultural theater. To visit was to prove you were educated, refined, and well-traveled. Tourists posed for portraits with the arches looming behind them, much as people do today with selfies. Different century, same impulse, prove you were here. Standing at the heart of history, you climbed the stone steps with them, hearing parasols rustle and carriage drivers shouting outside. The ruin hums with activity now, not the roar of Romans, but the chatter of foreign tongues and the scratch of quills recording impressions for posterity. It's a new kind of performance, played out by tourists themselves, and so the Colosseum, once half forgotten and half devoured, enters a new era as spectacle again, though this time, the audience is everyone who comes to see the ruin rather than the gladiators inside it. The chatter of noble tourists fades, and the Colosseum shifts again, this time under the boots of archaeologists. No more moonlit poetry or melodramatic sighs, now the ruin is measured, mapped, and prodded. You step into the 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars began to peel back centuries of soil and legend, eager to uncover what really lay beneath the arches. Mainstream fact: serious archaeological work in the Colosseum began in the 19th century, with excavations digging down into the hypogeum, the labyrinth of underground chambers where animals, gladiators, and stage machinery once waited to burst into the arena. By the late 1800s, much of the floor had been cleared away, revealing those eerie tunnels. What had long been imagined as a simple flat battlefield turned out to be a complex system of lifts, pulleys, and cages. Quirky tidbit: some of the early digs were a little improvised. One 19th century excavation accidentally flooded parts of the hypogeum because workers hadn't accounted for groundwater. Picture Rome's finest scholars staring into a giant muddy pool where they expected ancient wonders, arguing over whether they had accidentally rediscovered a Roman naval arena or just made a gigantic puddle. Historians still argue whether the Colosseum was ever truly used for large-scale naval battles, the famous Naumachii described in some sources. The hypogeum makes that difficult to believe. It's clearly designed for cages and machinery, not as a giant swimming pool. Still, some scholars insist that at least in its early years, the arena may have been flooded for small-scale mock sea battles. Others wave this away as overblown storytelling from ancient chroniclers who never had to clean up afterward. You stroll among the archaeologists in dusty coats, their notebooks filling with sketches of trapdoors, iron fittings, and stone channels. They debate over each new discovery. Was this groove for ropes? Was that pit for a winch? Each answer peels away a little of the myth, replacing imagination with mechanics. Tourists, meanwhile, still expected spectacle. They weren't thrilled about staring at half-dug trenches. Many complained that the Colosseum looked more like a construction site than the romantic ruin their guidebooks promised. Scholars, though, pressed on, determined to trade glamour for accuracy. They catalogued coins, bones, and even graffiti carved by long-gone spectators. One particularly amusing find was a scratched doodle of a gladiator, complete with oversized muscles and a cartoonish helmet. Apparently, ancient fans weren't so different from modern comic book sketchers. The floorless arena also shifted how people experienced the ruin. Without the sand covering it, visitors peered down into the hypogeum, imagining the chaos of lions pacing in cages, gladiators whispering prayers, stagehands sweating over heavy pulleys. The Colosseum became not just a ruin but a kind of 3D cross-section of history, with its guts exposed. By the early 20th century, photography joined the excavation frenzy. Scholars posed stiffly beside broken columns, while tourists bought postcards showing the ruin from every conceivable angle. The Colosseum became not just a monument but a case study, a laboratory of ancient engineering, and yet, through all the measuring tapes and soil piles, one thing didn't change: the arguments. Even as archaeology revealed more facts, legends clung stubbornly. The Christian martyr story still drew pilgrims. The sea battle debate still filled lecture halls. The Colosseum was becoming a battleground not of gladiators but of interpretations. You walk slowly through a shadowed corridor, hearing the echo of shovels, the mutter of scholars, the laughter of tourists unimpressed by muddy trenches. The ruin is once again performing, but now, the show is history itself being rewritten, one artifact at a time. The mud of excavation settles, dust giving way to polished stone, and you drift forward into the 20th century, where the Colosseum transforms into something far greater than itself, a symbol not just of Rome, but of an entire Italy. Once seen as a ruin to measure, sketch, or mourn, it now takes on a second life as a modern emblem. Its arches appear stamped onto coins, its silhouette plastered across posters, its battered profile lit dramatically with electric floodlights for the world to admire. What was once the shame of a missing half now becomes a badge of honor, displayed proudly as a testament to endurance, survival, and national identity. Mainstream fact: after the unification of Italy in the late 19th century, the Colosseum quickly emerged as one of the strongest icons of the young nation. By the early decades of the 20th century, it was everywhere, on postage stamps, in travel guides, in government pamphlets, and in the imagination of a people trying to anchor their present to the grandeur of their past. Under Mussolini's regime, the Colosseum became more than a monument, it became a stage for propaganda. His government spotlighted it as proof that fascist Italy was the rightful heir to Rome's imperial might. Parades were staged along its shadow, avenues cleared and rebuilt for dramatic backdrops, photographers directed to capture his soldiers in formation with the Colosseum looming behind them. The ruin was made to speak in a voice not entirely its own, enlisted in service to a modern empire that sought legitimacy in ancient stone. The quirky tidbit, almost absurd in its boldness, is that in the 1930s officials seriously considered reconstructing the Colosseum's arena floor so that Mussolini could stage modern spectacles there. Picture the incongruity: tanks rumbling beneath arches meant for gladiators, or motorbike stunt shows roaring where lions once prowled. Blueprints were drawn, plans debated, and engineers even speculated about whether armored vehicles could maneuver through the ancient gates. The idea fizzled, never realized, but the very fact that it was contemplated makes the ghosts of the Colosseum sigh. You can almost hear them mutter, "We did lions, not motorcycles." Historians remain divided over this period. On one hand, Mussolini's exploitation of the Colosseum pumped funds into its stabilization and restoration, scaffolding and repairs were undertaken in the name of national pride. On the other hand, the monument was stripped of neutrality, made to serve as a political tool rather than a universal heritage. Was it preservation through patronage? Or desecration through propaganda? The answer depends on which lens you choose to look through. As fascism passed and Italy moved forward, the Colosseum softened into a new role. By the 1950s and 60s, it was no longer a militarized symbol but an icon of cinematic romance. Films such as Roman Holiday placed Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck against its arches, rebranding the ruin from fascist backdrop to backdrop of love. Tourists swooned, postcards multiplied, and Hollywood's camera lenses polished its reputation anew. On the silver screen, the Colosseum was not cracked stone and missing walls, but eternal glamour. Meanwhile, Italian lira coins jingled with its arches pressed into their faces, reinforcing daily its status as shorthand for Italy itself. Olympic ceremonies framed it with torchlight, and parades of athletes passed near its shadow. Postcards flew across oceans with its silhouette sketched in bright, vivid ink. By mid-century, if you wanted to sell the idea of Rome, you needed no elaborate description, you only needed the Colosseum. Half intact or half ruined, it had become Italy's ultimate logo. And still, reality pressed in. Even as scaffolding clung to its flanks like a second skeleton and cranes hovered overhead, the ruins' image remained undiminished. Italians began to embrace its incompleteness as part of its character. The missing half was no longer seen as a flaw but as its defining feature, proof of its endurance. Without scars, the Colosseum would be just another stadium. With them, it was eternal. Walking through this century, you see floodlights casting theatrical shadows across arches at night, turning stone into stage scenery. Couples stroll hand in hand beneath it, capturing photographs long before smartphones existed, the flashbulbs of early cameras popping like fireflies. Schoolchildren arrive in chattering groups, waving tiny tricolor flags as they file through arches their ancestors once avoided. Politicians pose in front of it, using its silent grandeur as a backdrop for speeches about progress, each hoping to borrow a fraction of its ancient prestige, and so the Colosseum shifts yet again, from a ruin of utility, to a ruin of poetry, to a ruin of politics, and finally to a ruin of national pride. Each layer of history leaves behind its mark, like paint upon wood, visible if you know where to look. It is half gone, yet endlessly reinterpreted. You pause beneath its arches, hearing in imagination the echoes of coins clinking, cameras clicking, movie soundtracks swelling. The Colosseum no longer belongs to Rome alone, it belongs to the imagination of the world. A ruin, yes, but one that has transcended its stones, becoming an eternal emblem, stitched into memory by centuries of reinvention. You wander into the present, where the Colosseum stands both fragile and indestructible. The missing half has become more than a curiosity, it's a message. Travelers from every corner of the globe still file in, each one staring upward with the same wide eyes. They don't need to imagine the whole amphitheater anymore. The half that remains is enough. Mainstream fact: today, the Colosseum welcomes nearly 7 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited heritage sites on Earth. Restoration projects are constant, ranging from cleaning soot off marble to reinforcing arches against vibration from modern traffic. In 2021, plans were approved to build a new retractable arena floor, allowing visitors to walk out into the center and imagine what ancient spectacles might have felt like. Even after nearly 2,000 years, the ruin still reinvents itself. Quirky tidbit: tourists used to chip off little chunks of stone as souvenirs, stuffing them into pockets. Others scratched their initials into the walls, leaving graffiti in dozens of languages. Guides had to wag fingers constantly. This isn't Disneyland, it's history. In fact, some tour guides joked that if everyone took a pebble home, eventually the Colosseum would reassemble itself abroad like a stone jigsaw puzzle. Today, instead of chiseling bits away, tourists snap selfies, often turning their backs on the ruin to make themselves the centerpiece. The Colosseum photobombs millions of Instagram feeds daily. It has been hashtagged into digital eternity. The irony is clear: once it was the site where others were displayed for a crowd's entertainment, now it's the backdrop for a different kind of stage, the personal spotlight of social media. You pause, imagining all the perspectives layered on this one ruin: a medieval quarryman hauling stone away, a Renaissance artist sketching broken arches, a fascist rallying crowd under floodlights, a modern influencer angling for the perfect selfie. Each sees something different. Each makes use of the missing half in a new way. Historians today argue less about what the Colosseum was and more about what it means. Some see it as a reminder of cruelty, an empire that built its glory on blood and slaves. Others view it as a marvel of architecture, an engineering masterpiece centuries ahead of its time. Many simply treasure it as a symbol of endurance, a monument that shows ruins can be more beautiful than perfection. And you? You stand quietly, knowing the missing half is its secret strength. If the Colosseum had survived intact, gleaming white and whole, it might feel cold, too perfect, too untouchable. Instead, it bears the scars of centuries openly. Weather, neglect, greed, ambition, all visible in its absent stones. Its incompleteness makes it human. Perhaps that's why people never stop circling it, sketching it, photographing it, or writing about it. The ruin teaches something larger than Roman history: that beauty isn't about wholeness, but about survival. The missing half whispers not of failure, but of persistence. As you leave, the moonlight catches the arches, and the wind threads through broken corridors. You feel the ghosts of centuries watching you, not hostile, not mournful, but patient. The Colosseum has outlasted gladiators, emperors, popes, quarrymen, architects, tourists, and cameras. It will outlast us too. Half gone, yet eternal. Broken, yet whole. That is the Colosseum's true story. The night stretches a little longer now, and your breath slows as if it wants to keep pace with the rhythm of the old stones. The Colosseum drifts farther behind you, not in distance but in memory, the way an echo fades until only the silence feels whole. The arches are still there, but they shimmer now like shapes in a dream, softened at the edges, more suggestion than detail. You let the images blur, the missing walls, the weather-worn corridors, the shadows of crowds who once filled those seats, and they dissolve into something weightless, like clouds thinning across a pale sky. The tension in your shoulders loosens. The mind stops rehearsing battles and quarrymen and tourists, and instead lets the story become only a gentle hum. There's no need to hold on to every fact, every date, every stone. They've done their work already. What remains is only the feeling, endurance, softness, survival. Even ruins, even fractured places, can offer rest. Even incompleteness can feel safe, so as your eyes close heavier, imagine yourself sitting on one quiet block of stone in the moonlight. With no tourists around, no noise, no demands. The cool air brushes your skin, a steady wind like a lullaby. The world slows to match it. The ruin doesn't need to be whole, and neither do you, not tonight. Let the arches curve into sleep, the shadows deepen into dreams. You are safe here, unhurried, unwatched. The missing half of the Colosseum keeps its secrets, and you keep your stillness. Now rest.